The first thing you learn about hosting a barbecue is that everyone shows up with opinions about your grill technique. The second thing is that some guests arrive carrying secrets that'll blow your whole world apart. I'm Cole Redding, and I run a security systems business that keeps me busy enough to afford the kind of suburban house where people expect you to throw barbecues. The irony wasn't lost on me. A guy who installs cameras and alarms for a living, married to a woman who thought she was clever enough to cheat without getting caught. "Cole, honey, come meet my boss properly," Elaine called from across our backyard, her voice carrying that particular pitch it hit when she was performing for an audience. I looked up from the grill where I was turning burgers, wiping my hands on the apron that read, "King of the Castle," a Father's Day gift that felt more prophetic than funny these days. Elaine stood next to a tall man in expensive casual wear, the kind of guy who probably spent more on his weekend shirt than most people spent on groceries. "Garrett Waverly," she continued, her smile bright enough to power our neighborhood. "Meet my husband Cole. Garrett's the CEO of Waverly Innovations, and honestly, he's probably the smartest man I know. The smartest man she knows. At our barbecue, while I'm standing there with tongs in my hand like some suburban caveman." Garrett stepped forward with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in any room. His handshake was firm, deliberate, the grip of someone who'd already calculated the outcome of every interaction before it began. He looked at me with the satisfied expression of a poker player holding 4 aces. "Cole, great to finally meet you," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Elaine talks about you all the time." I bet she does, I thought, returning his grip with just enough pressure to let him know I wasn't intimidated. "All good things, I hope." "Of course," he laughed, but his eyes stayed locked on mine a beat too long, like he was measuring me for something, like he'd already won. I smiled back. 3 months of private investigator bills had taught me a few things about patience. The backyard was filling up with the usual suspects, neighbors, a few of Elaine's co-workers, my buddy Rick, who'd driven over from the city, and Mrs. Donnelly from next door who never missed a chance to collect fresh gossip. The kind of crowd that made suburban weekends feel both comfortable and suffocating. "These burgers smell incredible," said Megan, Elaine's best friend and designated enabler, appearing at my elbow with a wine glass already half empty despite the party being only an hour old. "You're such a good husband, doing all this work while Elaine gets to socialize." Megan had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. She was the type who'd tell you your haircut was so brave or compliment your wife's interesting fashion choices. Today, she wore the smug expression of someone who thought she was part of an inside joke. "Happy to do it," I said, flipping another burger. "Gives me time to think." "About what?" she asked, tilting her head like a curious bird. "Oh, you know. Life. Marriage. How well we really know the people closest to us." Something flickered across her face, too quick to catch, but there nonetheless. She took a larger sip of wine and drifted away toward the safety of the other wives. The afternoon sun was starting to slant through the oak trees, casting long shadows across our perfectly manicured lawn. I'd spent the morning setting up tables, arranging chairs, making sure everything looked picture-perfect for what I knew would be the last party Elaine and I would ever host together. My phone buzzed. A text from Rick. "Package delivered yet?" I glanced toward the driveway, then typed back, "Any minute now." "Cole?" Elaine's voice again, this time with an edge of excitement. "Come hear about Garrett's new project. It's fascinating." I walked over to where she stood with Garrett and a small cluster of admirers. Elaine had changed clothes twice before the party, finally settling on a sundress that was just expensive enough to signal her rising social aspirations. She'd been different lately. More attention to her appearance, more interest in networking events, more late nights at the office. "We're developing predictive analytics for consumer behavior," Garrett was saying, gesturing with his beer bottle. "Essentially, we can anticipate what people will do before they know they want to do it." "That sounds almost like mind reading," laughed Tara, another of Elaine's work friends. Not quite, Garrett smiled, but close. It's all about patterns. People think they're unpredictable, but they're not. Everyone leaves traces, digital footprints, habits. The key is knowing where to look. I nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like my line of work, actually. Security systems are all about predicting behavior, too. When someone might try to break in, what routes they'll take, how they'll try to defeat your defenses. Garrett's smile tightened just slightly. I suppose there are similarities. The difference, I continued, is that in my business, we assume everyone's trying to hide something. Makes the job easier when you start from that premise. Elaine laughed, but it sounded forced. Cole's always been paranoid. Occupational hazard, I guess. Not paranoid, I corrected gently. Careful, there's a difference. The conversation moved on, but I caught Garrett studying me with new interest. Good. Let him wonder what I knew. Mrs. Donnelly appeared at my shoulder, her wine glass topped off and her eyes bright with curiosity. At 73, she had the energy of a woman half her age and the investigative instincts of a seasoned detective. Nothing happened in our neighborhood without her knowledge. Lovely party, Cole, she said. That's Elaine's boss, isn't it? Handsome man. That's him. His wife seems nice, too. I saw her in the driveway a few minutes ago, getting something from her car. Looked like paperwork of some kind. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. Really? Thick envelope, the kind lawyers use. She sipped her wine and gave me a meaningful look. You know, dear, I've been married 47 years, long enough to recognize when someone's about to have a very interesting evening. Before I could respond, a commotion near the back gate caught everyone's attention. A woman was walking across our lawn with purposeful strides, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a black dress that suggested she wasn't here for burgers and small talk. Nora Waverly, Garrett's wife. And she was carrying a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. The crowd's chatter died down as she approached. Garrett's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of panic. Nora, he called out, his voice carefully controlled. I wasn't expecting you. I'm sure you weren't, she replied, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet backyard. She had the kind of presence that commanded attention, the bearing of a woman who'd learned early that the world would try to dismiss her if she let it. She walked directly to the picnic table where we'd set up the appetizers and, without ceremony, upended the envelope. Photographs scattered across the red checkered tablecloth like playing cards from a rigged deck. The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before thunder. I moved closer, along with everyone else, drawn by the universal human instinct to witness disaster. The photos were crystal clear, professionally shot, time-stamped in the corner. Hotel exteriors, hotel room doors, a man and woman entering together, leaving separately. The woman was unmistakably Elaine. The man was unmistakably Garrett. 18 different hotels, Nora announced, her voice steady as a news anchor. Over the past 4 months, always on days when Garrett claimed to be in meetings or traveling for business. Megan made a sound like a deflating balloon. Tara took a step backward. Mrs. Donnelly leaned forward with undisguised fascination. Elaine's face had gone pale. This is some kind of setup. Someone's trying to frame you? Nora's laugh was sharp as broken glass. With what, exactly? A time machine? These are surveillance photos, dear. Taken by a licensed private investigator. Would you like to see the phone records, too? She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. Subpoenaed from both your carriers. Text messages, call logs, even GPS data from your company phones. It's all here. Every lie, every excuse, every working late that was actually room service at the Marriott. Garrett finally found his voice. Nora, we should discuss this privately. Privately? She turned on him with the fury of a woman who'd been made a fool of for months. Like you discussed your affair privately? Like you discussed using company funds for your little romantic getaways privately? Oh yes, I have those records too. Turns out your assistant was very cooperative once I explained that she could either help me or explain to the IRS why she was processing fraudulent expense reports. The crowd was frozen, caught between the desire to leave and the impossibility of looking away. This was better than any reality show, and it was happening right here in our backyard. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Months of suspicion, weeks of planning, days of careful timing. It was all coming together exactly as I'd hoped. Elaine was looking around desperately, seeking an ally, an escape route, anything. Her eyes found mine across the circle of stunned faces. "Cole," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't believe this, do you? You know me. You know I would never—" I walked over to her slowly, aware that everyone was watching. When I reached her, I placed my hands gently on her shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "I know exactly who you are," I said quietly. "That's why I hired the investigator 3 months ago." The sound she made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Around us, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This was moving beyond entertainment into something raw, more painful to witness. "You hired—" Garrett's voice cracked slightly. "You orchestrated this whole thing?" I turned to face him, still maintaining that calm smile. "I orchestrated nothing. I simply documented what was already happening. The affair, the lies, the company credit cards, the weekend conferences that didn't exist. You two did all the heavy lifting. I just made sure someone was taking pictures." Nora was watching me with something that might have been approval. "Mr. Redding contacted me 6 weeks ago," she said. "Shared his evidence, suggested we pool our resources. Turns out we both married people who thought they were smarter than everyone else." "This is insane," Elaine said, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't just ambush people like this, in front of everyone. It's cruel. Cruel!" I felt my own mask slipping slightly, letting some of the anger I'd been carrying show through. "You introduced your lover to me as the smartest man you know at our own barbecue. You shook my hand and smiled while planning to destroy our marriage. And you want to talk to me about cruel?" The crowd was backing away now, sensing that this was about to get much more personal. Mrs. Donnelly, bless her heart, was taking mental notes that would fuel neighborhood gossip for years to come. "We should go inside," Elaine whispered. "Talk about this privately." "Actually," I said, reaching into my back pocket, "we should talk about these." I pulled out a folded set of papers and handed them to her. She unfolded them with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the legal text. "Divorce papers," I announced to anyone still listening. "Filed yesterday, citing irreconcilable differences and adultery, along with a complete financial disclosure that shows every asset we own, every debt we share, and how I propose to divide them." Elaine stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. "You filed already? Without even talking to me?" "I talked to you plenty. Every time I asked about your late nights, your new clothes, your sudden interest in team-building exercises. You talked back. You just didn't tell the truth." Garrett was looking around wildly, probably calculating how quickly this would spread through their professional network. "Look, everyone makes mistakes. People can work through—" "Mistakes?" Nora's voice cut through his babbling like a sword. 18 hotels, Garrett. 4 months of lies. Thousands of dollars in company funds. That's not a mistake. That's a lifestyle choice." She turned to address the remaining crowd. "And since we're being so public about everything, I might as well mention that Garrett's employment contract includes a morality clause. Adultery, especially involving company resources and subordinate employees, is grounds for immediate termination and forfeiture of all stock options and severance benefits." Garrett's face went white. "You can't be serious." "The board meets Monday morning," Nora continued pleasantly. "I've already sent them copies of everything, along with a formal complaint about the misuse of company funds and the creation of a hostile work environment through inappropriate relationships with staff." I had to admire her thoroughness. Nora Waverly was clearly a woman who believed in covering all her bases. The party, such as it was, began to dissolve. Neighbors made awkward excuses and headed for the gate. Co-workers exchanged meaningful glances and whispered among themselves as they gathered purses and car keys. Even Mrs. Donnelly, after offering me a supportive pat on the shoulder, made her exit. Within 20 minutes, the only people left in our backyard were me, Elaine, Garrett, and Nora. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Finally, Garrett cleared his throat. "This doesn't have to be the end of everything," he said, looking between Elaine and me. "People make mistakes. Marriages can be rebuilt. Careers can recover." I almost laughed. Even now, caught red-handed with his pants down and his future in ruins, he was still trying to manage the situation. "You're right," I said. "This doesn't have to be the end of everything. For me, it's actually a new beginning." I walked over to the grill and started scraping it clean. The burgers were overcooked now, forgotten in the drama, but the routine of cleaning up felt good. Normal, like taking the first step toward a life that made sense again. "Cole," Elaine said, her voice small and desperate. "Please, can we at least talk about this? Alone?" I looked at her, really looked at her, for what I knew would be one of the last times. The woman I'd married 8 years ago, who'd promised to love and honor me, who'd shared my bed and my dreams and my bank account while planning her escape with another man. "We can talk," I said finally. "But not here. Not today. Today was about truth. Tomorrow we can talk about lawyers." Nora was gathering up the photographs, sliding them back into the envelope with businesslike efficiency. "Garrett," she said without looking at him, "I'll expect you out of the house by Sunday. My attorney will be in touch about the divorce proceedings and the financial settlements." "Nora, please." 8 years of marriage," she interrupted. 8 years of building a life together, supporting your career, hosting your business partners, playing the perfect corporate wife. And you threw it away for what? A few months of sneaking around with your employee? She finally looked at him, and her expression was colder than winter. "I hope it was worth it." She walked toward the gate, then paused and turned back to me. "Mr. Redding, thank you for your cooperation in this matter. I'm sorry your marriage became collateral damage in my husband's midlife crisis." "Mrs. Waverly," I called after her, "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." She smiled, and for the first time that day, it looked genuine. "Actually, I'm not. This way, everyone knows exactly who they really are." After she left, Garrett and Elaine stood in my backyard like actors who'd forgotten their lines. The sun was getting lower, casting longer shadows across the lawn, where an hour ago we'd all been pretending to be civilized people at a civilized party. "I should go," Garrett said finally. Elaine looked at him with panic in her eyes. "What about us? What about everything we planned? What about it?" His voice was flat, defeated. "It's over, Elaine. My marriage, my job, probably my career. There is no us anymore. There's just damage control." He walked away without looking back, leaving Elaine standing alone next to the picnic table, still scattered with the evidence of her betrayal. "Cole," she said, turning to me with tears starting to form in her eyes, "I know how this looks, but you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," I said, continuing to clean the grill. "You fell in love with someone else. You decided I wasn't good enough anymore. You made your choice." "It wasn't like that. It just happened. We didn't plan for it to—" 18 hotels, Elaine. 4 months of lies, company credit cards and fake conferences and elaborate cover stories. That doesn't just happen. That takes planning. That takes commitment. That takes looking at your husband every morning and deciding he's not worth the truth. She was crying openly now, but I found I didn't care as much as I thought I would. The grief had been burned out of me over the past few months, replaced by something harder and more focused. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you pack your things. You find somewhere else to stay. You call a lawyer and we work out the details. The house is in my name. The business is in my name. And thanks to your signed prenup, your claim on either one is limited." The prenup was just a formality. You said it didn't mean anything. I say a lot of things. Doesn't make them true. She stared at me as if seeing a stranger. "You're different. This isn't like you." "No," I agreed. "The old me would have confronted you privately, would have given you a chance to explain, to apologize, to work things out. The old me believed that marriage meant something, but the old me didn't know he was married to someone who could look him in the eye and lie for 4 months straight." I finished cleaning the grill and closed the lid. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "I loved you," Elaine said quietly. "Maybe you did, but you loved the idea of him more." She stood there for another minute, maybe hoping I'd change my mind, maybe just processing the reality that her carefully constructed double life had collapsed in the span of an hour. Finally, she walked toward the house. "Elaine," I called after her. She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes. "Next time you want to compliment another man in front of your husband," I said, "make sure your husband isn't smarter than you think he is." I watched her go inside, then looked around my backyard. Paper plates and plastic cups scattered on the tables. Folding chairs arranged in conversation clusters. The detritus of a party that had started as a lie and ended as a reckoning. My phone buzzed. A text from Rick. "How'd it go?" I typed back, "Better than expected. Need anything?" I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "Just a beer, and maybe help moving some furniture tomorrow." "Done. Proud of you, man." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and started collecting the trash. There was something satisfying about cleaning up, putting things back in order, preparing for whatever came next. The smartest man she knows. That's what Elaine had called Garrett Waverly, right here in my backyard, while I stood at my own grill like some suburban fool who didn't know his wife was planning to trade him in for a newer model. Turned out the smartest man at the barbecue was the one who'd been quietly gathering evidence for 3 months, timing the revelation for maximum impact, and making sure everyone who mattered got to see exactly who they were dealing with. I finished cleaning up as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and paperwork and the complicated business of untangling 8 years of shared life. But tonight, for the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood, and it felt like solid ground. Monday morning came with the kind of gray drizzle that makes everything look like a crime scene. I was in my workshop by 7, going through the motions of normal life while my phone lit up with messages from people who'd either been at the barbecue or heard about it secondhand. The suburban gossip network moves faster than fiber optic internet, and by Sunday night, the story had spread to every corner of our little community. I'd become either a hero or a villain, depending on who you asked and how they felt about public humiliation as a form of justice. Mrs. Donnelly had knocked on my door at 8:30 with a casserole and a hungry look in her eyes. She wanted details, the kind of inside information that would make her the queen of the neighborhood coffee clatch for months to come. "Such a shame about Elaine," she'd said, not sounding particularly sorry. "Though I have to say, Cole, you handled it with remarkable composure. Some men would have made a scene." "I'm not much for scenes," I told her, accepting the casserole because refusing would have been rude and because I genuinely didn't know when I'd have time to cook for myself again. "Still," she'd continued, settling into my kitchen like she planned to stay a while, "it must have been quite a shock. Finding out about the affair, I mean." "Not really, I'd suspected for a while." Her eyes had lit up like Christmas morning. Had you really? What gave it away? I'd considered how much to tell her. Mrs. Donnelly was harmless enough, but she was also the neighborhood's primary information distribution center. Whatever I said would be repeated, embellished, and analyzed by every gossip from here to the highway. Little things, I'd said finally. New clothes, late nights, the way she started talking about work differently. And that boss of hers, so arrogant. Did you see the way he looked at you when they introduced him? Like he thought you were some kind of fool. I had seen it. That smug confidence, the handshake that lasted just a beat too long, the way he'd positioned himself next to Elaine like he belonged there. Garrett Waverly had walked into my backyard thinking he was the smartest person there, and he'd left knowing exactly how wrong he'd been. Now, Monday morning in my workshop, I was trying to focus on the security system installation I had scheduled for later in the week. But concentration was hard to come by when your phone kept buzzing with updates from the ongoing disaster. Rick had texted me at dawn. Waverly's company called an emergency board meeting. Word is, they're voting on his termination today. That was fast, even by corporate standards. But then again, when your CEO gets caught using company funds to finance an affair with a subordinate, swift action becomes a matter of self-preservation for everyone involved. My workshop occupied the entire basement of the house, a space I'd converted over the years into something between a high-tech laboratory and a traditional craftsman's shop. Security systems, cameras, motion detectors, and alarm panels lined the walls alongside more traditional tools. It was my sanctuary, the place where I came to think and plan and work with my hands. Elaine had moved out Sunday night, taking only what she could fit in her car and promising to arrange for the rest of her things later. The house felt different without her presence. Not empty exactly, but cleaner somehow. Like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The landline rang, interrupting my thoughts. I almost didn't answer it, but the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, which usually meant business. "Redding Security," I said. "Mr. Redding? This is Janet Morrison from Channel 7 News. I was wondering if you'd be available for an interview about the incident at your barbecue this weekend." I nearly laughed out loud. "An interview? We're doing a story about infidelity in the workplace and how it affects families. Your situation has become quite a talking point in the community, and we thought—" "Ms. Morrison," I interrupted. "I appreciate your interest, but I'm not looking to become a public spectacle. The people who needed to know the truth now know it. That's enough for me. But surely you have something to say about how you handled the situation, the planning involved, the coordination with Mrs. Waverly. It's quite an unusual approach to—" I hung up before she could finish. The last thing I needed was to become the poster boy for elaborate revenge schemes. This wasn't about publicity or making a statement. It was about justice, pure and simple. My cell phone rang almost immediately. Rick's number. "Please tell me you didn't just hang up on Channel 7 News," he said without preamble. "How did you—" "Never mind. Yes, I hung up on them. I'm not interested in being interviewed. Cole, you might want to reconsider. The story's already out there. Might as well control the narrative." "What story? What are you talking about?" "Check your email. Someone leaked the whole thing to the local paper. Photos, timeline, everything. Your front page news, buddy." I put the phone on speaker and opened my laptop, navigating to the website of our local newspaper. The headline made my stomach drop. "Local man orchestrates elaborate revenge at neighborhood barbecue." The article was detailed, well-researched, and absolutely devastating to everyone involved. Someone had provided the reporter with a complete timeline of events, including details about the private investigator, the coordination with Nora Waverly, and even quotes from several party guests. "This is insane," I muttered, scrolling through the article. "Who would leak all this?" "Could be anyone who was there," Rick said. "Could be Mrs. Waverly's attorney trying to build public support for her divorce case. Could be someone from Waverly's company trying to distance themselves from the scandal. Hell, could be Mrs. Donnelly trying to get her 15 minutes of fame." I thought about my neighbor's eager questions, her obvious delight in being close to the drama. It wouldn't surprise me if she'd called the paper herself. The point is, Rick continued, it's out there now, and from what I'm hearing, you're coming off pretty well. Most people think you handled it perfectly. Most people? Well, there's always going to be some who think you should have handled it privately. But the general consensus seems to be that Elaine and Waverly got what they deserved. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. This was spiraling beyond anything I'd planned. I'd wanted justice, not publicity. I'd wanted the truth to come out, not to become a local celebrity. There's something else, Rick said, his tone shifting. I've been doing some digging into Waverly's business. The affair might be the least of his problems. What do you mean? I mean, there are rumors about some creative accounting practices, missing funds, inflated contracts, that kind of thing. Word is the IRS has been sniffing around for months. That was interesting. If Waverly was facing financial crimes on top of the adultery scandal, his world was about to get much more complicated. How reliable are these rumors? Reliable enough that I'd be very careful about any business dealings with Waverly Innovations. And reliable enough that Mrs. Waverly's attorney is probably having a very good week. We talked for a few more minutes about the practical implications of the news coverage, then Rick had to go. I was left alone in my workshop with the uncomfortable realization that my carefully planned private revenge had become very public entertainment. The phone rang again. This time, it was a number I recognized, my lawyer, David Chen. "Cole, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Have you seen the news coverage?" "Just finished reading it." "Good. Because we need to discuss how this affects your divorce proceedings. The public nature of the revelations could complicate things." "How so?" "Well, on one hand, you have documented proof of adultery, which strengthens your position significantly. On the other hand, Elaine's attorney could argue that the public humiliation constitutes emotional distress, which might affect the settlement negotiations. I hadn't considered that angle. In my focus on exposing the truth, I might have inadvertently given Elaine's legal team ammunition to use against me. What do you recommend? Keep a low profile. Don't talk to any more reporters. Don't post anything on social media. And be prepared for Elaine's team to paint you as vindictive and calculating. I am vindictive and calculating. David laughed despite himself. Yes, well, we don't need to advertise that fact. Can you come in this afternoon? We should go over your financial disclosures and prepare for what's likely to be a contentious negotiation process. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my workshop and tried to process how quickly everything was moving. 3 days ago, I'd been a suburban husband with a cheating wife and a secret plan. Now I was a local news story, a cautionary tale, and apparently a symbol of something larger about marriage and betrayal and justice. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the article. You're my hero. My wife cheated too, but I didn't have the guts to do what you did. A fellow victim. Then another. What you did was cruel and unnecessary. There are better ways to handle marital problems. Disappointed neighbor. And another. Channel 7 wants to interview me about the barbecue. Should I talk to them? Megan. Megan. Elaine's best friend and chief enabler. The woman who'd stood in my backyard drinking my wine while knowing exactly what her friend was doing behind my back. The woman who'd made snide comments about my marriage while helping to destroy it. I typed back, "Do whatever you think is right. Just remember that everything you say will be public record." It was a subtle threat, but I wanted her to know that I hadn't forgotten her role in all this. Megan had been more than just a passive observer. She'd been an active participant, covering for Elaine's lies, and probably encouraging the affair. The workshop door opened, and Jonas came down the stairs carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing his usual grin. Jonas worked for me part-time, helping with installations and maintenance calls. He was 25, built like a linebacker, and had the kind of cheerful disposition that made him impossible to dislike. "Morning, boss," he said, handing me one of the cups. "Figured you might need some caffeine after your weekend excitement. You heard about it?" "Heard about it? Man, you're famous. My girlfriend saw the article and called me at 6 this morning wanting all the details. Said you're either a genius or a psychopath, and she wasn't sure which." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you're definitely a genius, not sure about the psychopath part yet." He grinned and settled onto a stool near my workbench. "Seriously, though, that was some next-level planning. How long were you working on it?" 3 months of investigation, 2 weeks of coordination with Mrs. Waverly, about 30 seconds of actual execution. And you timed it for the barbecue because I wanted everyone to see who they really were. Elaine, Waverly, all the people who knew what was happening and said nothing. I wanted them to have to face the truth in front of people who mattered to them. Jonas nodded thoughtfully. "Public accountability. I respect that. Though I have to ask, aren't you worried about backlash? I mean, some people are calling you vindictive." "Some people think justice and vindictiveness are the same thing. They're not. Justice is giving people exactly what they've earned through their own choices. Vindictiveness is punishing people beyond what they deserve." "And you think public humiliation is what they deserved?" I considered the question carefully. "I think honesty is what they deserved. The humiliation was just a natural consequence of their actions being exposed. If they'd been honest from the beginning, there would have been nothing to expose." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, organizing equipment for the week's installations. Jonas had a good understanding of security systems and an even better understanding of human nature, which made him valuable in both aspects of the business. Around 11, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed Elaine's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want, Elaine?" "Cole, please, we need to talk. This whole thing has gotten out of hand." "Has it? Seems to me it's gotten exactly as public as your actions deserved. The newspaper article makes me look like some kind of monster. People are calling me names, sending me nasty messages. My parents saw it. My sister called crying. I'm sorry your family is disappointed in you, but that's not my fault. You orchestrated this whole thing. You planned it. You coordinated it. You made sure it would be as humiliating as possible. How is that not your fault?" I felt my temper rising, but kept my voice level. "I documented your affair. I shared that documentation with the person who had the most right to know about it, Waverly's wife. What happened after that was the natural consequence of your choices. You could have talked to me privately. You could have given me a chance to explain." "Explain what? 4 months of lies, 18 hotel visits, using your company credit card to pay for romantic getaways with your boss? What explanation could possibly justify that?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke again, her voice smaller and more defeated. "I know I made mistakes. But I loved you, Cole. I still love you. Can't we find a way to work through this? You loved me so much that you introduced your lover as the smartest man you know at our own barbecue. You loved me so much that you shook his hand and smiled while planning to leave me for him. That's not love, Elaine. That's cruelty. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Garrett and I were going to handle things properly. We were going to tell our spouses, get divorced, do everything the right way." "When? After another 4 months of lies? After you'd figured out how to maximize your financial settlement? After you'd lined up your next job at his company?" "It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. And now everyone knows it." I hung up before she could respond. Jonas was watching me with interest. "The ex-wife?" he asked. "Soon-to-be ex-wife. She wants to work things out." "And you're not interested? Would you be? If someone betrayed you that completely, that systematically, would you be interested in working things out?" Jonas thought about it for a moment. "Probably not. But then again, I've never been married. Maybe marriage makes people more forgiving." "Marriage is supposed to be built on trust. Once that's gone, what's left? Good point. We went back to work, but I found myself thinking about Elaine's phone call. There had been something in her voice, not just sadness or regret, but genuine surprise that I wasn't willing to forgive and forget. As if she'd expected that exposing her affair publicly would somehow clear the air and allow us to start fresh. It made me wonder how well she'd ever really known me. The man she'd married might have been willing to work through infidelity, to find a way to rebuild trust, to prioritize the marriage over his own pride. But that man had ceased to exist the moment I'd seen the first hotel receipt in her purse. The afternoon brought more phone calls, reporters, neighbors, even a few potential clients who'd seen the news coverage and decided they wanted security systems installed by someone who clearly understood the importance of surveillance and documentation. By 5 o'clock, I'd scheduled 3 new consultations and turned down 4 interview requests. The publicity was a double-edged sword, good for business, but exhausting to manage. Jonas was packing up his tools when my phone rang one more time. The caller ID showed Nora Waverly's number. "Mrs. Waverly," I answered. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected, actually. I wanted to thank you for your discretion with the media. I know you've been getting interview requests. I'm not interested in being famous. I just wanted the truth to come out." "Well, it certainly has. Garrett's been terminated, effective immediately. The board voted unanimously this morning. Apparently, the affair was just the tip of the iceberg." "So I heard. Financial irregularities?" "Among other things. It seems my husband has been quite creative with company funds over the past few years. The affair expenses were actually minor compared to some of the other things they've discovered." "I'm sorry. That must be difficult to hear." "Actually, it's liberating. For months, I thought I was losing my mind. Garrett was acting strange, defensive, secretive. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. Now I know I was being observant." I understood that feeling perfectly. "There's something else," she continued. "I wanted to let you know that Garrett's attorney contacted me today. They're claiming that our coordinated revelation constitutes some kind of conspiracy to defame him. They're threatening legal action." "Against both of us?" "Apparently. Though my attorney seems to think it's mostly bluster. Hard to claim defamation when everything we revealed was documented fact. Still, it's something to keep in mind. My lawyer mentioned that the public nature of the revelations might complicate things." "Let them try," Nora said, and there was steel in her voice. "I have 8 years of financial records showing exactly how Garrett spent our money. I have testimony from his assistant about the pattern of lies and cover-ups. I have hotel receipts and credit card statements and a paper trail that would make an accountant weep. If he wants to make this a public legal battle, I'm prepared for that." After we hung up, I sat in my workshop as the sun set outside the small basement windows. The day had brought more complications than I'd expected, but also a certain clarity. The truth was out, completely and irrevocably. There was no going back, no pretending, no comfortable lies to hide behind. Elaine and Garrett had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. The public humiliation, the professional ruin, the personal devastation, all of it was the direct result of their own actions. I hadn't created their problems. I'd simply made sure those problems couldn't be hidden anymore. My phone buzzed with one final text of the day from Rick. "Drinks tomorrow night? I think you've earned them." I typed back, "Definitely, and thanks for having my back through all this." "Always, brother, always." I turned off the lights in my workshop and headed upstairs to the house that was now truly mine. Tomorrow would bring more complications, more legal maneuvering, more fallout from the weekend's revelations. But tonight, for the first time in months, I could sleep without wondering what lies I was living with. The smartest man at the barbecue, indeed. Wednesday brought rain and a summons to appear in family court for a preliminary hearing on the divorce proceedings. Elaine's attorney had apparently decided that aggressive tactics were the way forward, painting me as a vindictive husband who'd orchestrated a cruel public humiliation instead of seeking proper counseling or mediation. I sat in David Chen's office reviewing the motion they'd filed, which painted a picture of me as some kind of master manipulator who'd violated my wife's privacy and dignity for the sake of revenge. "They're claiming emotional distress," David explained, sliding the papers across his desk. "Intentional infliction of emotional harm through public humiliation. They want the court to consider that when dividing assets." Can they do that? They can try, but they have to prove that your actions were beyond the bounds of reasonable response to adultery. Given that everything you revealed was factually accurate and directly relevant to the marriage, it's going to be a hard sell. I read through the motion, noting the careful language designed to make me sound like a calculating villain. According to Elaine's attorney, I had systematically violated the defendant's privacy, orchestrated a public spectacle designed to cause maximum humiliation, and demonstrated a pattern of controlling and vindictive behavior inconsistent with the spirit of no-fault divorce proceedings. "What about the adultery itself?" I asked. "Doesn't that count for something?" In a no-fault state, adultery doesn't automatically affect asset division, but it can be considered if it involved the waste of marital assets, which it clearly did in this case. Hotel bills, restaurant charges, gifts, all paid for with money that belonged to both of you. David leaned back in his chair and studied me with the expression of a man who'd been practicing family law for 20 years and thought he'd seen everything. "Cole, I have to ask, do you have any regrets about how you handled this? Any second thoughts about the public nature of the revelation?" I considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my wife chose to have an affair instead of talking to me about whatever problems she was having with our marriage. I regret that her boss was arrogant enough to think he could shake my hand while sleeping with my wife. But do I regret exposing the truth? No. Even knowing that it's complicated the legal proceedings? Especially knowing that, if I'd confronted them privately, they would have had time to prepare, to coordinate their stories, to hide assets, to make sure they came out of this looking like the victims. This way, everyone knows exactly what happened and who's responsible for it. David made some notes on his legal pad. "That's going to be our defense, that you were protecting your legitimate interests as a spouse and ensuring that the truth came out before it could be covered up or distorted. Is that enough?" It should be, especially given what we're learning about Waverly's financial situation. If he was embezzling company funds or engaging in other criminal activity, it's going to be hard for them to claim that you were the one acting inappropriately. We spent another hour going over strategy and preparing for the court hearing. As I was leaving David's office, my phone rang. "Jonas. Boss, you need to get down to the Waverly house, now." "What's going on?" "Police cars, lots of them, and what looks like federal agents." I drove across town to the upscale neighborhood where Garrett and Nora Waverly had lived their seemingly perfect life. The scene that greeted me was like something out of a crime drama. Unmarked sedans, uniformed officers, and serious-looking people in suits carrying boxes of evidence out of the house. I parked down the street and walked closer, noting the FBI windbreakers on several of the agents. Whatever they were investigating, it was bigger than adultery and company credit card abuse. Nora Waverly stood on the sidewalk talking to a woman in a navy suit, her expression calm but strained. When she saw me approaching, she excused herself and walked over. "Mr. Redding, I suppose you're wondering what all this is about." The thought had crossed my mind. Financial crimes, wire fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. Apparently Garrett's been quite busy over the past few years. The affair investigation led them to examine his expense accounts more closely, which led to the discovery of some very creative accounting practices. We watched as agents carried computer equipment and file boxes out of the house. The scale of the operation suggested this wasn't a minor case of expense account padding. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. "Preliminary estimates suggest somewhere around $2 million over 3 years. Fake contracts, inflated invoices, kickbacks from vendors. He was running what amounts to a personal slush fund through the company. $2 million. That explained the federal interest and the scope of the investigation. It also explained why Garrett had been so confident, so arrogant. He'd been living well above his legitimate means for years. Where is he now? Arrested this morning at his hotel. Apparently, he's been staying at the Marriott downtown since I kicked him out. The same hotel where he conducted his affair, which the agents found somewhat ironic. There was a certain poetic justice to that. Garrett Waverly, who'd thought he was smart enough to embezzle millions and conduct an affair without consequences, arrested in the very hotel where his arrogance had begun his downfall. What does this mean for your divorce proceedings? It simplifies things considerably. Hard to claim you deserve half the assets when most of them were purchased with stolen money. My attorney is already working with the federal prosecutors to ensure that I'm protected as an innocent spouse. A black sedan pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit got out. Even from a distance, I could tell he was a lawyer, probably Garrett's criminal defense attorney arriving to assess the damage. "I should go," Nora said. "Thank you again for everything. If you hadn't exposed the affair when you did, I might never have learned about the financial crimes. I could have been implicated as an accessory." After she left, I stood on the sidewalk watching the federal agents methodically dismantle what had once been Garrett Waverly's carefully constructed life. The man who'd shaken my hand like a conqueror was now facing decades in federal prison. My phone buzzed with a text from Rick. "Heard about the FBI raid. You really know how to pick your enemies." I typed back, "I didn't pick him. He picked my wife. Either way, looks like your barbecue revelations were just the appetizer. The main course is going to be a federal trial." He was right. The adultery scandal that had dominated local news for 3 days was about to be overshadowed by a much bigger story. Garrett Waverly wasn't just an unfaithful husband and unethical boss. He was an alleged criminal who'd been stealing from his own company to fund his lifestyle. I drove back to my house, trying to process how quickly everything was escalating. What had started as a simple case of marital infidelity had become a federal investigation. The private investigator I'd hired to document an affair had inadvertently uncovered evidence of major financial crimes. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my effort to expose Garrett's personal betrayal, I'd accidentally exposed his professional crimes as well. The man who'd thought he was smarter than everyone else had been undone by his own arrogance and my refusal to be made a fool of. That evening, I met Rick at the Quarry, our usual bar, and the kind of place where serious conversations happened over serious drinks. The crowd was lighter than usual for a Wednesday night, but I recognized several faces from the neighborhood. People who nodded at me with expressions ranging from sympathy to admiration to barely concealed curiosity. "So," Rick said, settling into the booth across from me with a beer, "how does it feel to be responsible for bringing down a major corporate criminal?" "I'm not responsible for anything except documenting what was already happening." Garrett Waverly brought himself down. "Come on, Cole. If you hadn't hired that PI, if you hadn't timed the revelation for maximum impact, none of this would have come to light. Waverly would still be stealing money and sleeping with your wife. And I'd still be married to a woman who thought I was too stupid to figure out what she was doing." Rick raised his glass. "To being smarter than people think you are." We drank to that, but I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. The FBI raid would make national news. Garrett's crimes would be dissected in the financial press. The affair that had started it all would become a footnote in a much larger story about corporate corruption and white-collar crime. "Have you talked to Elaine since the arrest?" Rick asked. "She called this afternoon. Apparently she's devastated by the news about Garrett's crimes, claims she had no idea about any of it." "Do you believe her?" I considered the question. "I believe she didn't know the details, but I also believe she didn't want to know. Elaine always had expensive tastes and never asked too many questions about how they were funded. As long as Garrett could afford nice restaurants and luxury hotels, she wasn't interested in examining the source of his wealth too closely. That's going to be a problem for her if the feds decide to investigate her involvement. She wasn't involved. Elaine's many things, but she's not a criminal. She's just someone who fell in love with the idea of a lifestyle she couldn't afford and a man who promised to provide it. The bar's television was tuned to the local news, and as we watched, a breaking news banner appeared. Local CEO arrested in multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. The story that followed included footage of the FBI raid, interviews with former employees, and a brief mention of the adultery scandal that had led to the discovery of the financial crimes. I found myself staring at the screen as they showed file footage of Garrett at various corporate events, always smiling, always confident, always projecting the image of a successful businessman who had everything under control. The contrast with his current situation, arrested, disgraced, facing federal charges, was stark. "You know what the craziest part is?" Rick said, following my gaze to the television. If he'd just been honest about wanting a divorce, none of this would have happened. He could have left his wife, married yours, and continued embezzling money for years without anyone being the wiser. But that would have required him to see me as a real person instead of an obstacle to be managed. Garrett Waverly's biggest mistake wasn't the embezzlement or even the affair. It was underestimating the husband of the woman he was sleeping with. "The smartest man she knows," Rick said with a grin. Turns out that title was already taken. We finished our drinks, and I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, where I'd built what I thought was a stable life. The house looked different now, not empty, but purposeful, like a place where someone lived who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. My phone had several voicemail messages waiting, one from David Chen, updating me on how the federal charges would affect our divorce proceedings, one from a reporter asking for comment on the arrest, one from Mrs. Donnelly, wondering if I'd seen the news and whether I wanted to come over for dinner and discuss the situation. The last message was from Elaine, her voice shaky and uncertain. "Cole, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that I had no idea about Garrett's crimes. I would never have gotten involved with someone who was stealing money. I'm not that person. Please call me back. We need to talk about how this affects everything." I deleted the message without calling her back. Elaine's problems with the federal investigation were her own to solve. I'd spent enough time cleaning up the messes created by her poor judgment. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room, looking around at the space that was now entirely mine. The furniture we'd chosen together, the artwork we'd collected over 8 years of marriage, the photographs that documented a relationship I'd thought was real. Tomorrow, I would start the process of making this space truly my own. New furniture, new photographs, new memories that belonged only to me. The life I'd been living was over, but the life I was building was just beginning. And unlike my marriage, this new life would be built on truth instead of lies, on reality instead of illusions, on the solid foundation of knowing exactly who I could trust. The answer to that last question was simple. Myself. The smartest man at the barbecue, indeed. 3 weeks after Garrett Waverly's arrest, I was installing a security system at a client's house when Jonas burst through the front door with the kind of urgent energy that usually meant trouble. "Boss, you need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. "Elaine's giving an interview on Channel 7, live." I set down my drill and took the phone, watching as my soon-to-be ex-wife sat across from Janet Morrison, the same reporter who'd tried to interview me weeks earlier. Elaine looked polished, professional, and utterly convincing as she explained how she'd been manipulated and deceived by both Garrett Waverly and apparently me. "I was caught between two men who were playing games with my life," she was saying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Garrett lied to me about his financial situation and his intentions, and Cole orchestrated this elaborate revenge scheme that destroyed any chance we had of working through our problems like adults." So you're saying your husband's actions were as harmful as your lover's? Morrison asked, leaning forward with the predatory interest of a reporter sensing a good story. I'm saying that what Cole did was calculated to cause maximum harm to everyone involved. He could have talked to me privately. He could have suggested counseling. Instead, he chose public humiliation and destruction. I handed the phone back to Jonas, who was watching my reaction with interest. You okay, boss? I'm fine. Elaine's entitled to tell her side of the story. Even when her side of the story is complete nonsense? Especially then. The truth doesn't need protection from lies. It just needs to be stated clearly and allowed to stand on its own merits. But as I went back to work, I found myself thinking about the interview and what it represented. Elaine was trying to rehabilitate her image by portraying herself as a victim of manipulation by two different men. It was a clever strategy. Admit to making mistakes while claiming those mistakes were the result of being deceived and controlled by others. The problem was that it might actually work. People wanted to believe that cheating spouses were victims of circumstances rather than architects of their own destruction. It was more comfortable to think that affairs happened because of manipulation and deception rather than simple selfishness and moral failure. My phone rang as I was finishing the installation. David Chen. Cole, we need to talk. Elaine's interview has complicated things. How so? She's claiming that your actions constitute domestic abuse, emotional manipulation, invasion of privacy, deliberate infliction of psychological harm. Her attorney is using the interview as evidence that you're an unfit spouse who drove her into the arms of another man through your controlling behavior. I felt my jaw clench. That's ridiculous. Maybe, but it's also effective. The family court judge is going to see a tearful woman claiming she was abused and manipulated, versus a man who admittedly orchestrated an elaborate public humiliation. Optics matter in these proceedings. What do you recommend? We fight back. Hard. I'm scheduling a press conference for tomorrow morning. You're going to tell your side of the story, with documentation, and we're going to make it clear that Elaine's portrayal of events is selective at best and dishonest at worst. I don't want to do a press conference. Cole, you don't have a choice anymore. Elaine has made this a public relations battle. If you don't respond, her version of events becomes the accepted narrative. That could cost you significantly in the divorce settlement. After we hung up, I sat in my truck outside the client's house and tried to process how quickly things were escalating again. I'd thought the worst was over when Garrett was arrested, and the truth about his crimes came to light. But Elaine had apparently decided that her best defense was a good offense, painting herself as a victim and me as an abuser. Jonas knocked on the truck window, breaking me out of my thoughts. Boss, there's something else you need to know, he said as I rolled down the window. Megan and Tara are backing up Elaine's story. They're telling people that you were always controlling and suspicious, that you made Elaine's life miserable with your paranoia and jealousy. Of course they are. They're trying to protect themselves from being seen as enablers who knew about the affair and said nothing. What are you going to do about it? I thought about that question for a long moment. What was I going to do? I could hold a press conference, present my evidence, defend my actions and my character. I could fight Elaine's narrative with facts and documentation and the testimony of people who actually knew me well, or I could do something else entirely. Jonas, how would you feel about taking a little road trip? Where to? The Marriott downtown. I want to have a conversation with the hotel manager about their security footage from the past few months. Why? Because if Elaine wants to play games with the truth, I'm going to make sure everyone has access to all the relevant facts. We drove downtown to the Marriott where Garrett had been arrested, and where, according to the private investigator's report, he and Elaine had conducted much of their affair. The hotel manager, a professional woman named Patricia Wells, agreed to meet with us after I explained that I was involved in ongoing legal proceedings related to activities that had taken place at her hotel. Mr. Redding, I want to be clear that we take guest privacy very seriously, she said as we sat in her office. We can't provide footage or information without proper legal authorization. I understand, but I'm not asking for footage. I'm asking for confirmation of something that might be relevant to federal criminal proceedings as well as my divorce case. I pulled out copies of the hotel receipts that the private investigator had obtained, showing the dates and times of Garrett and Elaine's visits. These receipts show 18 separate visits over 4 months. What I'm wondering is whether your security system would have captured any evidence of the guests engaging in behavior that might be relevant to the criminal case against Mr. Waverly. Patricia studied the receipts carefully. Mr. Redding, I can't discuss specific footage, but I can tell you that our security system is quite comprehensive. Elevators, lobbies, parking areas, restaurant and bar areas, everything is recorded and stored for 90 days. And if federal prosecutors were to request that footage as part of their investigation into Mr. Waverly's crimes, we would, of course, comply fully with any legal request for evidence. I smiled. That's all I needed to know. As we left the hotel, Jonas looked at me with admiration. You're going to tip off the feds about the security footage. I'm going to suggest to the federal prosecutors that they might want to examine all available evidence related to Mr. Waverly's activities, including his personal conduct during the time period when he was embezzling company funds. And if that footage shows Elaine participating in activities that contradict her victim narrative, then the truth will speak for itself. We drove back to my house, where I found Mrs. Donnelly waiting on my front porch with a casserole dish and a determined expression. Cole, dear, I saw that horrible interview your wife gave. Such lies. I wanted you to know that there are plenty of us who know the real story. Thank you, Mrs. Donnelly. I appreciate your support. More than support, dear. I've been talking to the other neighbors, the ones who were at your barbecue. We're all willing to testify about what we saw, what we heard, how Elaine and that man behaved. You're not going to face this alone. I was genuinely touched. Mrs. Donnelly might be a gossip, but she was also a woman with a strong sense of justice and an even stronger sense of community loyalty. That's very kind of you. Nonsense. It's just right. That woman stood in your backyard, introduced her lover as the smartest man she knows, and now she wants to claim you were abusive? We all saw how she looked at him, how they stood together, how comfortable they were with their deception. She's not fooling anyone who was actually there. After she left, I sat in my living room and called Rick. I need a favor, I said when he answered. Name it. I need you to contact the federal prosecutors handling the Waverly case. Tell them they might want to examine hotel security footage from the Marriott downtown for the dates when Waverly was meeting with his co-conspirators. Co-conspirators? I thought Elaine wasn't involved in the financial crimes. She wasn't, but the prosecutors don't know that yet. And if they review security footage looking for evidence of criminal conspiracy, they might accidentally discover evidence of other activities that could be relevant to my divorce proceedings. Rick was quiet for a moment. Cole, that's either brilliant or ruthless. Maybe both. It's necessary. Elaine wants to play victim and rewrite history. I'm going to make sure the complete truth is available to anyone who wants to see it. What if the footage shows something that makes you look bad too? Then I'll deal with the consequences. But I'm betting it shows exactly what we already know. That Elaine was a willing participant in an affair with a man she knew was married, using company funds to pay for their activities and lying to everyone about what she was doing. And if she was more involved in Waverly's crimes than she's claiming, then she'll have bigger problems than our divorce proceedings. The next morning brought news that the federal prosecutors had indeed requested security footage from multiple hotels where Garrett Waverly had conducted business meetings and personal activities. The request was part of their ongoing investigation into his financial crimes, but it would inevitably capture evidence of his affair with Elaine as well. David Chen called me with an update on how this development would affect our divorce case. Elaine's attorney is panicking, he said with satisfaction. They're trying to withdraw her television interview and claiming she was emotionally distraught when she made those statements. Too late for that, isn't it? Much too late. The interview is public record now, and it's going to be very difficult for her to claim she was manipulated and abused when there's video evidence of her participating willingly in an extended affair. What about the press conference you wanted me to do? Cancelled. We don't need it anymore. The evidence is going to speak for itself. That afternoon, I was working in my shop when Jonas came downstairs with a grim expression. "Boss, you need to see the news. Elaine's been arrested." I looked up from the security panel I was programming. Arrested for what? Conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Apparently, the hotel footage showed her participating in meetings with Waverly and some of his business associates. The feds think she might have been more involved in the financial crimes than anyone realized. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This wasn't what I'd intended. I'd wanted the footage to contradict her victim narrative, not to implicate her in federal crimes. How bad is it? Bad. They're saying she helped facilitate some of the fake contracts that Waverly used to embezzle money, used her position in HR to process paperwork and payments that she knew were fraudulent. I sat down heavily on my workbench stool. The woman I'd been married to for 8 years, the woman I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, was now facing federal criminal charges. Whatever anger I felt toward her, I'd never wanted this. The workshop felt suddenly smaller, the familiar smells of wood, oil, and metal pressing in on me. My hands rested uselessly on my knees as my mind tried and failed to reconcile the person I thought I knew with the headlines scrolling across my phone. I'd imagined exposure, consequences, accountability. I hadn't imagined mugshots, indictments, and decades-long sentences. "There's more," Jonas said quietly. His voice carried the weight of someone who already knew how bad the next sentence would be. "Megan and Tara have been arrested too. Apparently they were all involved in some kind of scheme to create fake consulting contracts and split the payments." I closed my eyes for a moment. The scope of the conspiracy was bigger than anyone had realized. What had looked like a simple case of adultery and corporate embezzlement was actually an elaborate criminal enterprise involving multiple participants and millions of dollars in stolen funds. Shell companies, layered transactions, forged invoices. The affair wasn't the crime, it was just the cover. My phone rang. It was Rick. "Cole, I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted." His tone was careful, measured, the way people speak when they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. "No, it's not," I said. "I wanted justice, not destruction." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Rick replied. "Elaine made her choices, just like Waverly did. The consequences aren't your responsibility." I stared at the scarred surface of the workbench, tracing old cuts and burn marks with my eyes. Aren't they? If I hadn't hired the PI, if I hadn't exposed the affair, none of this would have come to light. "And Elaine would still be stealing money while cheating on you," Rick said gently. "Cole, you didn't create this situation. You just refused to be a victim of it." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure there was an answer, just a slow, painful acceptance. That evening, I sat in my living room watching the news coverage of the arrests. Elaine, Garrett, Megan, Tara, all led away in handcuffs, all facing decades in federal prison. Cameras flashed, reporters spoke in urgent tones. The affair that had destroyed my marriage was reduced to a footnote, just one component of a much larger criminal conspiracy. The reporter was calling it one of the largest corporate fraud cases in the state's history. The investigation was ongoing, with more arrests expected. The victims included not just Waverly's company, but also numerous vendors and clients who'd been defrauded over a period of several years. People I'd never met, businesses I'd never heard of, all tangled into the same web that had quietly wrapped itself around my life. I turned off the television and sat in the quiet of my house, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing outside. trying to process how completely my world had changed in the span of a few weeks. The woman I'd married was a criminal. The man she'd left me for was a criminal. Her closest friends were criminals. I'd been living inside a carefully maintained illusion, one built on lies, theft, and manipulation, without ever realizing it. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Donnelly. "Saw the news. Are you okay, dear?" I typed back, "I'm fine. Thank you for asking. If you need anything, just let me know. We're all thinking of you." I appreciated her concern, but the truth was that I felt oddly peaceful, not happy, not relieved, just settled. The anger and betrayal that had consumed me for months were gone, replaced by something cleaner and more final. Justice had been served, even if it had taken a form I hadn't expected and a scale I couldn't have imagined. Elaine had made her choices, and now she would live with the consequences. The same was true for Garrett, Megan, Tara, and everyone else who'd participated in their conspiracy of lies and theft. As for me, I was finally free. Free from a marriage built on deception. Free from people who'd seen me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Free from the exhausting task of trying to understand behavior that had never been meant to make sense. The smartest man at the barbecue had turned out to be the one who'd refused to be made a fool of. And now, finally, everyone knew it.